All right, welcome. We are going to do a hunting consult with Thomas Mlsna, the owner of the Untamed Ambition. Is that what your consulting company is called?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Thomas goes around and does probably some of the best work in hunting consulting. We have this new property that we are listing, and we're going to go through his normal kind of consulting day to break down how good this property is for hunting purposes. So before we head out there, we're just looking at this map. This is the boundaries of the property. First things that stick out to me is I know for sure we're in a big buck area. There's been really nice mature bucks killed on this property. And you are just north of a county lake, which does have a lot of public. And we have a lot of different terrain features here with actually pretty good access. So you have the ability to have tons of cover for bedding, and then you have the ability to put food in selective places. What's kind of your first thought when looking at it?
So we're going to look at this property from the perspective of a holistic hunting management plan. So with that being said, we want to look at this as a whole. It's going to start today with this on-site habitat and hunting analysis, but before we go out there, I always like to look at the property and how it looks as a system, and then zoom out a little bit and look how it fits into the surrounding landscape as a much bigger system, which this property, in that sense, is in a gorgeous area. A lot of topography, a lot of connecting cover. There's a lot of potential deer movement and outside recruitment that'll take place because we're not super isolated. And then we're going to walk out to the property itself and look at how the property is made up of many individual systems. And overall, we're looking at the potential of the property. So when we assess a property from a hunting standpoint, through this hunting and habitat analysis, most people, if they're going to buy a hunting property, their main objective is to hold and be able to hunt high quality deer, mature bucks, right? So the first question is always, what does it take to hold mature bucks on a property? And it's really pretty simple at the end of the day. We're looking for availability of food, availability of cover, and availability of sanctum, or secure, secluded areas on the property. At first glance, when we take a look at this property, you can see there's pretty good access along this whole entire south side. So that's a big advantage, specifically on that sanctum or cover element there, because we can get into the property from a lot of different locations without disturbing the bulk of the property. The next thing is going to be the food element there. And that we obviously have to get boots on the ground. But again, knowing the area, knowing the potential of the area in general, we know that there's all the potential in the world for a lot of diverse food sources. And white-tailed deer, especially mature bucks, are creatures of diversity. So the more diverse the food sources are on that property, the more that buck is going to spend, the more time that buck is going to spend on the property. And that goes into that holdability side of things. So we want to make sure the property can hold deer, hold those mature bucks. We want to make sure that you can hunt the property. So we're going to rate it on huntability as well. And then we're going to rate it on overall management efficiency, or the potential. So today, there's kind of two perspectives that we're taking. First and foremost is the here and now. What is the current situation on that property? But ultimately, we're trying to visualize the overall potential for a property like this. So what could a prospective buyer turn this property into based on their goals? And we're going to analyze this through the lens of hunting and habitat.
So just looking at it right now, like the things that stick out to me is you have a nice south face for bedding. I mean, obviously this sticks out to me right here. This is technically like the main access point right now.
Okay.
But then you have a nice power line that you can easily access there. So like you wouldn't want to go walk up through this and get to these ag fields through that way, but coming up this area, coming down through, holding bedding in these areas, and then you can ambush from that location. But just having all the different, if there's a west wind, it's easy for them to bed in different locations. Even a south wind, you have this back portion that's super undisturbed, and then your main north wind during the winter that is important to hold deer with food. But what do you think? I mean, how much you want to bet we're going to find some nice bedding spots?
Oh yeah, yep.
I mean, just this area, they can swap during the day and hit different winds.
Correct. So yeah, that's a big thing. I mean, diversity of bedding locations is huge when it comes to holdability on a property, right? any given day that wind is out of a certain direction, if the property doesn't set up for multiple bedding locations on different wind directions. And by that, most deer, especially mature bucks, want to bed with their back up against cover and the wind at their back. Topography is the greatest form of cover. So anytime you're purchasing land or if you own land in an area with a lot of topography, which obviously we're in the heart of the Driftless region right now, that topography is a huge, huge advantage. It doesn't ebb and flow with the seasons like vegetative cover does. So topography is a solid, solid foundation, and based purely on the topography, because we haven't seen the vegetative cover yet, based purely on topography, this property offers a lot of diverse bedding. Like Taylor said, a lot of good south-facing.
I like how the ridge sets up north to south too. I
Yep,
like properties
It,
like
it
that.
keeps deer moving, gives them a lot of options. But you have that south-facing for good winter thermal cover, so they can get out of the wind. Most of the time when we have a cold north wind, they get out of that north wind and get the sun from the south. At the same time, it sets up for good warm or hot thermal cover in the heat of the summer, because they can get on the other side of this and get those southern breezes and get in the shade a lot more. But the biggest thing I like to look at is considering the prevailing winds themselves. Most of our wind directions in this area are going to be out of the west at some variant, typically mostly southwest, but west in general. So if we look at that, most of our air movement's coming from this direction. This whole area here is phenomenal bedding, a lot of potential. Even these little nooks and crannies here are going to hold deer. Even these spots like this, up in these draws and these fingers, is going to hold deer on anything westerly. And then, on those north winds, those east winds, those deer can just pop across that valley or tuck right in. So from a holdability standpoint, there's a lot of diverse bedding options on this property, which is going to hold those bucks a lot more throughout the year, throughout the week, throughout the fall. When you're trying to hunt them, they don't have to leave the property when the wind changes to find better bedding locations.
I would use this access point. Keep this open. I don't really want deer bedding in there. Can you get access into this spot to hunt the food and then hunt more consistently? I do love these access points for ambushes, but then you don't want to burn it too.
You're correct, but what you're saying makes perfect sense. So having two access points is obviously very advantageous. We always want to think
technically you can dive off anywhere in here. But
yeah. Well, you always want to think the way that I break properties down. We'll talk about these four key elements: wind, pressure, food, and timing. And we use those elements to kind of quantify all the different variables at hand, and then ultimately put together a logical explanation or reason why we put a stand location in a certain area, how we access, so on and so forth. So what Taylor's talking about is a huge advantage, because if your food sources, your primary evening movement type food sources, the transitional food plots, the larger ag fields, that's all up top in this scenario. There's not going to be a lot of movement going down low in the evening. Most of those deer are going to work their way up to the top. But that's advantageous because we can use this access point to come up in here, hunt that food source as those deer transition out into those fields. On the other side of that, having this other access, we can slip in that ambush point for a morning hunt to tuck in a travel corridor somewhere close to those bedding locations without blowing deer off a field.
That's probably a pretty sweet pinch right there.
Yeah. It's probably going to be a steep hill to climb, but those short, intense climbs, a lot of times, you're gaining elevation real quickly using that topography as cover, so the deer really have no idea you're there, and you're not disturbing much of your property in general. So
yeah, and there are old logging roads. I'd probably recommend anybody that comes in. We're going to look at the timber value today, but first thing, come at least bring a logger in to reopen some of those roads and gain, because you still want access roads from coming up into the field, or
correct.
I'm not sure how they all lay out right now, but
and that goes into the management efficiency side of things, right? If we can't access certain areas of our property, we don't have to access all areas of our property, I'll say that, but if we can't access most of our property, then it's really hard to manage property. So when we get out there, we'll evaluate that. And a lot of times, like Taylor was saying, if there's timber value on the property, you can use that timber value, a percentage of that timber value, to pay for better access. The loggers come in, it's feasible at that point to cut in extra roads or clean up existing roads, and you can use that to improve access across the property as a whole, which helps us with ongoing management.
yeah. All right, well, let's get our boots on the ground
And get our hand warmers. So at first glance, we're down on the bottom of this property, and I can tell from the composition of the current vegetation that this was probably a cattle pasture for a fair period of time. That's overgrown now. So from a deer hunting perspective, that's advantageous. You can see how much cover is in here. There are a fair bit of invasives, but those can easily be removed with good management. Beyond that, what I see in here that's really intriguing from a wildlife standpoint is there's some bur oaks, some good oak trees down in here, and there's also some old apple trees down in here. So right there we have hard mass and soft mass food value for those deer. Along with that, we've got a lot of bramble and stuff like that. We've got some good shrubs down here. You know, along with some of these invasives, there are some good natives in here. I see some elderberry and some nannyberry and a lot of other berry producing shrubs that produce a soft mass for deer, for birds, but they also produce woody browse for those deer, and that's what's going to sustain deer through late fall and into the winter. So what I'm seeing right now looks really good habitat wise. We just need to get up on top and see what it looks like for bedding cover, you know, like the primary bedding locations.
Yeah, and access wise, you know, there is like, you can tell there's an old trail along this creek that's been beat up a little bit, but you know, right now this creek is the best
Access, yeah.
path.
Which for walking into hunt, that's
That would be
awesome.
ideal
Yeah,
anyways.
yep.
But yeah, you're gonna want, you know, this clarifies, like, you definitely want to try to get, ideally we can find some trees that would be of value. You can get a logger in here, but even if you don't get a logger in here, a dozer coming through here making some roads for a day or two would be helpful, because the originals exist. They just have to be
Cleaned
opened
up.
back up.
Yeah.
So to me, this is the place that I would try to access. And if you, I think we have a quote on file to put a culvert in here, and if you actually wanted to make a road, oh, that's a squirrel. If you wanted to actually make a road to be able to access this field, it really wouldn't take too much, and it'd probably be worth it as far as accessing the whole property. I mean, what do you think as far as, like, I like how this woods opens up as we get closer up top here. Like, I think you'll be able to access this. You know, it's one of those things, like, if you can get to a point where you're coming in and out of here a lot, and they'll get kind of used to it.
Yeah, you know, there's two perspectives there to address. It's the, well, I guess we back up. We talk about pressure on deer, and obviously access affects that pressure. There's two things that reduce pressure on deer: cover and consistency. So you're talking about the consistency side. You can improve on that by adding more cover and obviously screening off this access route, which is pretty straightforward. You know, you can feather back some more of these trees. You can plant some conifers in here. You can put some tall grasses in. It's all relative to where those deer are going to be positioned when you try to access. So the other side of that, on the cover side, is making sure there's a lot of cover in your bedding areas themselves, so the deer can't see very far.
Yeah, keep, you know, because we're probably, I mean, this is as open as it gets throughout a season. But
yeah,
you know, you have 10 acres here that you don't want to be bedding.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, it's more open in there, but you know, there's a really nice flat spot as this transitions down. So you get your deer to park downstream a little bit further, not so close to your access route, gives you all the space that you need to get in and out of here. But to your point, this is the worst of the worst conditions wise. So the bulk of the year, the bulk of the fall, this access here will probably be fairly screened. Deer won't really be able to see a whole lot.
Yeah. And I kind of like that. That's why you make your parking spot, your campsite down at the bottom. The deer are used to you being down there.
So their movement's kind of going this way,
you know,
anyway.
Like, or they're even, like, you know, they're bedding on those knobs looking down at that spot. And then this is the spot that, you know, I would, if I were buying it, I would get a road in here so I can drive up and down it pretty consistently.
Yeah,
to get them
agreed.
used to it.
This whole spot is absolutely gorgeous. I mean, from a habitat potential perspective, this sets up, it's already set up to where it just needs some good timber stand management, and you can turn it back into more oak savanna type setting, which creates more early successional growth that those deer really thrive on. And it brings a lot of food value. I'd be willing to bet we walk over here, we're going to find some beds on the high point of this hill, anywhere around these points, but this spot over here in particular, just kind of, you know, with that west wind coming through here like this, I feel like this is gonna be the spot. I mean, we're gonna find, like I said, we're gonna find beds all over, with fresh beds.
This right here is where we talked about that being a pinch. Where
Yeah,
it
right
drops
around
off.
this corner over here, right? Yeah, look at this. Bed, bed, bed. It's a big bed.
I was gonna say, yeah. Bachelor group.
Could be. Yeah, this is about the best time of the year to analyze a property. I walk properties year round. I like to walk them in the summer. You can see a lot of vegetative growth, but ultimately, from a deer perspective, this time of the year is when things are at their lowest point, right? We can see the weak points in a property right now. All of the food is gone. Most of the cover is gone. What's left, what remains right now is the foundation of what holds deer on a property. So when we look around a property like this, we're looking for woody browse, we're looking for solid cover. Again, topography is the greatest form of cover. So we've got all of that right now. This property has all of that. And put that into perspective, if I'm a deer, I'm not 6 feet tall. I live at about 36 to 40 inches. You know, this is about how tall a deer is standing up. So when I look around, how far can I see based on cover? Looking back towards the UTV where we drove in, I can only see about 40 yards because this hill rises up. If I go down the hill a little bit further, it starts to break even more, but there's still some benches. So there's really good spots for deer to tuck in and bed. And then from that bedding perspective, you know, we talked about that wind at the back. So a deer can bed here. The other thing that makes a bedding area really good is visibility. Really, those deer just need to be able to survive. If they smell a threat or see a threat or hear a threat, they need to be able to see and slip away real quickly. And this sets up perfectly for that. On top of that, another component that makes a bedding area really good is food in that bedding area. There's a little bit of browse and bramble in here. A little bit of management can really wake up that seed bank and get a lot more browse in here. But the big component that you can't fix in a 2 or 3 year management plan is hard mass. When you look around in here, there's a lot of oak trees, red oaks, white oaks, bur oaks. So you've got a good variety of hard mass in here, which during the fall specifically, when we're trying to hunt these deer, that's going to be about 20 to 25% of a deer's diet. So having that hard mass, especially in and around your bedding areas, leads to more holdability on a property. And this, everything we're seeing so far is just absolutely gorgeous.
The cool thing is this is the first knob that we came out in. It's also the one that we said on the TV was going to be the good one. But when you look down over this hill, like for an ambush spot, like this isn't as steep as I had thought it was. Like it really wouldn't be that terrible of a walk to get up here.
No, and you have good access, you know, as far as like your access coming in from the bottom, as far as like traversing the landscape, isn't too bad. So like you said, you can kind of follow the bottom of the hill in and then just straight shot up to a stand location. It's not bad at all. And even better than that is, you know, you don't want to hunt in this bedding area, but that ambush site is between multiple bedding areas. So that's the ideal spot to be.
Probably back there where it pinches.
Yep. So right here, I would confidently say is a buck bedding location. And the reason for that is typically what we see with the bucks bedding in relation to the does, in relation to the food source. The analogy I use with clients is a multi-layered cake. If you can visualize a multi-layered cake, the base layer of that cake is generally a high quality or consistent food source. The next layer of that cake is generally where your does are going to bed. But the icing that holds those layers together is the cover. So we need some isolation with cover to separate the does from the food source. And then if we want to stack another layer on top of that cake so that we have our bucks bedding on the property within moving distance of that food source, you know, in that evening movement, then we need to add another layer of cover there. Again, back to topography being such a great form of cover, we found beds up there. We've got a good spot for food plot, a field up on top. So that's our base layer, the food, the field. The next layer in, we found beds, lots of beds, most likely a doe family group. Now we come down here, we've got more cover, isolation, the topography, the vegetation. There's some big boulders in here. We have this nice little shelf here with a couple beds here. There's rubs around. This is definitely where a buck is parking himself in isolation. He can see, he can get away, lots of escape routes here. This is definitely a buck bedding area. When we're trying to manage property holistically, even if our main focus is deer, we want to look at species diversity across the board. A beautiful thing about this property, there's a lot of diverse hardwood species out here. Everything from walnuts that have timber value to oaks that also have timber value, but a lot more wildlife value. This here is a shagbark hickory. A little bit of timber value, not super high on that list. It produces a hard mass, the hickory nut. Not super preferred hard mass by deer, obviously benefits squirrels and other animals. But an less obvious benefit to shagbark hickory as it pertains to your deer herd is the fact that this is primary habitat for bats. So all this shaggy bark, especially in these cold winters that we have on the south-facing side, is a great spot for a bat to climb up in there and spend his day, or even maybe the entire winter. But even throughout the summertime, bats use shagbark hickory. Now you might ask yourself, why is that important, or how does that benefit my deer? Well, bats are insectivores. They consume primarily flying insects, and a lot of those flying insects cause problems with deer. They put stress on deer. They bite deer. They spread disease to deer. So having better bat habitat on a property reduces the pest insects, mosquitoes, biting flies, so on, and that reduces stress on your deer. So when we look at species diversity and look at the system as a whole, having a lot of diverse tree types, a lot of different diverse plant species, all comes back around to make our deer hunting better. So this is the location we were talking about before we came out here as a potential morning stand location. We've got really good bedding over there, really good bedding out here, and this draw kind of works its way down to that access point from the bottom. So you can hunt this without putting a lot of pressure on the bedding locations, and you can get up here without deer on top of the hill coming back from those food sources without them knowing that you're here. Pretty clean shot from the bottom of the hill up, and this spot's actually pretty gradual compared to some of these other points. So come from the bottom, get a stand set up in one of these nice big white oaks. Obviously food value pulling deer through here, but the big thing that I want to consider specifically hunting hill country like this is what's that thermal air movement going to do? So a spot like this, until the sun comes up and actually starts to hit this hillside, the thermals are going to be pulling your scent down the hill. And then once the sun does come up and warms up this hillside, it's going to take your scent up. But it's not going to go right up across the ground. It's going to just kind of gradually get higher and higher. So if you start out 15 or 20 feet in this tree, most of those deer coming off this hill or traversing this hillside between these bedding areas are never going to know you're here, because your scent's going to go either up above them or it's going to be dropping down, going back in where you accessed from. Really good location for a morning stand. All right, I'll take a second to talk about this problem right here, right? We don't want to present this property as being all roses, because every property does have management obstacles in its way. This particular species here is a highly invasive common buckthorn. Now, common buckthorn, the problem with common buckthorn is it's a purgative to deer. Deer eat a wide variety of different browse and herbaceous growth, but this particular plant they can't eat. It makes them sick. The pros and cons of it, I should back up. That's the downside of it, right? It's invasive, it spreads, deer can't eat it. But on a positive note, given the rest of the species makeup in this specific location and throughout most of this property, we have a lot of oaks in here. So to restore this area back to higher quality habitat and improve or enhance all of the potential that it has, we can run fire through here. And the beauty of that situation is that buckthorn is not fire tolerant. So a big tree like this, we're going to have to cut this down and treat it so it doesn't grow back. But all these little seedlings that you see in here, all these little seedlings are also buckthorn, and those can be taken care of with a well-timed prescribed fire. So it's a problem. It's not that big of a problem. The reality is there are no properties that are totally invasive free, and even if they are, the neighboring property probably has invasives. So it's not so much how do you get rid of them, but how do you manage your property to maintain the highest amount of biodiversity, i.e. keep the invasives at bay. And we can do that with prescribed fire. This property sets up pretty well for that, and we have this great oak overstory in here. Oak is a very fire tolerant species, so if we move that fire through here, we promote the things that we want and we kill off the things that we don't want. So important to note, but like I said, it's a problem. Every property has problems we have to solve, and this one's relatively easy to solve. Oh, there's a mega rub down there. All right, we've got another one of those top layer of the cake scenarios here. This is a really interesting topographical feature here, land feature. We're out on this little finger that protrudes out from this ridge line. Again, top layer of the cake. It's very clearly buck bedding location. There's a bed right over here. There's a massive rub here. I mean, if you take a peek at this rub compared to my thigh, that's a very consistently used historical rub. So every year, whatever mature buck is utilizing this particular bedding area is obviously spending time rubbing on that. The other unique feature about a feature like this in general, or the unique benefit of a feature like this, because this finger comes out, a buck can bed here and he can catch the wind from so many different angles and still have that survival advantage. But the one thing I really wanted to note, and I don't know how well you can see from the camera, but if you look straight down the hill from here, you can actually see where the truck is parked. So this is a spot where a deer is going to post up and watch that location. It's not going to blow a buck off the property if you park there or if your campsite's down there, but they're just going to keep tabs on you, and they're not going to walk down towards you, obviously, which is why it's advantageous to have multiple points of access on a property like this. So here's another prime bedding location. I always like to look at these bedding locations and ask, what can I do to make it better, right? Again, we're kind of surrounded or submersed more so in this sea of buckthorn. So we need to solve that problem. But what I really like about this bedding area, two things. One, overhead oaks. So we have that hard mast again. That's really beneficial. But on the other side of it, we have a poplar stand. It's not a big stand of poplars. I can see it kind of extends up the hill probably 50, 60 yards, maybe even 100 yards. So it's kind of a strip of poplar in here. What's unique or ideal with poplar or aspen is this tree species has a colonial root system. So all of these trees that you see here are the same genetic clone of one specimen. What that means is when we want to regenerate a stand like that, if we come here and cut them down, it regenerates at a very high stem count, 7,000 to 10,000 stems per acre. It gets really thick in here. But the biggest benefit to our deer and deer hunting is that species in particular is a highly preferred browse species. So we can, in short order, get rid of the buckthorn, replace it with a much higher quality browsable species in here, maintain the same level of cover, same level of security in an awesome bedding location like this. This is a really cool spot. This is another one of those little fingers that comes off of that main ridge line. But what's cool about this, just how the topography rolls, we got this nice little bedding spot here, and then it breaks off here. Not too bad, there's a deer trail there, but it breaks off and there's a nice little secluded bench there. We'll walk down on that bench and I'll show you how secluded that is. Again, topography, greatest form of cover. A deer gets down there, they're completely isolated from any threats. Yeah, super, super cool location. You can see, again, everything that makes a bedding area good is a spot where a deer is protected, they're aware of their surroundings, and they can get away from it, or any potential threat, they can get out of there real easily. So you look behind us, there's a big rock wall there. That topography, that rock formation, however you want to look at that, there's a solid wall of cover back there. There's a nice trail coming in from here. There's a trail going out that way. There's trails going out that way. But if I'm a deer and I'm bedding right here, I'm going to be about yay high. I can see all potential threats below me. When those thermals are rising, I can smell that coming up from the bottom. I can smell what's coming off the top, and I'm completely protected back there. So another really cool bedding location on this property. A big thing with topography, again, greatest form of cover, but the biggest advantage to the topography on a property like this is it creates more surface area. So this is a 111, 112 acre property. This really lays out more like a 250-ish acre property. I mean, we haven't even covered a third of the property yet, and we've already found 15 or 20 prime bedding locations. So there's a ton of potential on this property for holding deer. So we came across another unique feature on this property. If you look right here on this hillside and right above here, there's kind of some spots that there's a bunch of ground missing, essentially, right? There's like these big divots or craters essentially here. But if you look behind me, you can see this subtle bench that wraps around the hill. Most likely, this was an old quarry. Not a very big road because they were probably just pulling a wagon up here with a horse or two. But this is probably where they came to get some rocks to build a foundation, build a bridge, whatever it might be. But these are some old quarries on this property. The unique feature from a hunting perspective is when you get on these hillsides, a lot of times there's not adequate flat spaces for deer to bed. But because this old road is here, it's created this little subtle bench that the deer use to travel and also bed on, giving them yet another area or another more surface area in general where they can bed with an elevated advantage and they're back up against the cover of this hill. So another cool spot on this property. This particular location is very secluded. The road's not too terribly far away down there, but there's a lot of distance and a lot of cover between it. And then it's kind of tucked back in around this corner, isolated from the other bedding areas, isolated from the food sources up top. So another really cool, interesting bedding location. Again, just adding more surface area and more spots to park deer on this property. There's also some old apple trees here, which is cool too. From a huntability standpoint, when we're scouting these properties, we're primarily looking for pinch points or areas where deer movement is more concentrated, more defined. The pinch point itself is all relative to the effective range of your weapon. So if we're trying to choke deer down into range of a gun, obviously that's much wider or a much broader pinch point in general than trying to get them into bow range, right? But when I talk about pinch points or when we're scouting for pinch points, there's three main types of pinch points that I'm looking for. The first, and here's a good example of it, is a physical resistance type pinch point. Something that's creating an obstruction or adding resistance to a path of travel and choking deer down to a defined area. So we look down this, there's a ravine here. As we go down, the ravine gets a little bit steeper, it's a little bit more washed out, there's trees down in there. It's just a hard spot for deer to cross. So that's forced those deer in this spot to cross right here. And the same if you look up this ravine, it's steep and it's rocky, and not a lot of places to cross there. So there's going to be a pinch point at the head of this ravine. There's also one here. If someone wanted to, they could come in, drop some of these lower quality trees, and turn this whole ravine into a physical barrier to force all the deer movement up the hill from this location. So physical resistance is the first type of pinch point. The second type of pinch point is going to be an attraction-based pinch point. So something that draws deer into that location. Could be a limited resource like an apple tree or a water hole or a mock scrape or something along those lines. It might not necessarily pull deer from miles away, but if they're moving through this general area, it's one more excuse to pull them into that defined location. The third type of pinch point is going to be a hybrid pinch, so a combination of those two. And ultimately, when we're trying to create really, really high quality hunting locations on a property, we're trying to create that hybrid system. So is there a spot where deer are already choked down by some sort of physical barrier? Let's add some level of attraction to that to give them another reason to be there. On the other side of that, if we have an attraction like a food plot and we're drawing deer in there, let's add some physical resistance to control how and where those deer enter that food source so that we have more consistent opportunities at hunting those deer. So that's pinch points in general. Again, when it comes to huntability of a property, we have to define those pinch points or find those pinch points, because not only are those pinch points areas that are moving deer into weapon range, but it's also an area where we have to understand, or where we can control our scent dispersion, right? So if we're moving deer up around this spot, that's a good spot to push our scent when we're hunting so that deer don't smell us. So pinch points are absolutely essential. We've got a licking branch here, most likely a scrape underneath this. Obviously when the snow's not there, you'd be able to see it. See the car driving by in the background. Right behind me, out on this point, we have another top layer of that cake where we're going to be bedding bucks. There's some rubs out there, and those bucks love to bed in locations where they can observe potential threats. So a buck will bed out on that point, not afraid of those vehicles because they're on the other side of a ravine, and that threat never imposes or breaches their bubble of safety. But this primary scrape right here, this would be a phenomenal location to throw up a camera, a cell camera, so you're not in here disturbing the area. But a buck is going to check this scrape coming and going from this bedding area. He's going to check it for the does that are up in here spending a lot of time. He's going to check and see if other bucks have come through here. But these community scrapes are basically telephone booths for deer. That's how they communicate with one another. So it's always good to see sign like that. Tons of sign on this property. Rubs everywhere, beds everywhere, just phenomenal. With our hunting and habitat analysis, we're looking at availability of food, availability of cover, and availability of sanctum. On the food component specifically, this is where a lot of hunters get it wrong. A lot of land managers, especially whitetail land managers, get it wrong. We're going to talk about food plots in a little bit when we assess the locations and the possibilities for food plots on this property. But food plots are only a small portion of a deer's diet. Cultivated food sources in general, ag fields and food plots, are a small portion of a deer's diet, less than 20%. When we look at things that really move the needle or really make a big difference, positive impact on holding deer, creating abundance on a property, providing a lot of nutritional content, which in turn grows bigger deer, we want to look at browse. So when we look at browse, native browse, there's three main categories that we're looking at. There's woody browse, there's bramble, and there's herbaceous browse. So behind me here, you can see this is an area on the property that was logged a little bit heavier. And just based on what's growing here, I'm going to assume that there was a handful of walnuts here, or the main species composition was walnuts. And the reason for that is walnuts, black walnuts specifically, produce a chemical compound called juglone. It's allelopathic, and by that I mean it inhibits the growth of other plant species. So typically what happens is you end up with a lot of bramble, a lot of blackberries, raspberries, stuff like that in those areas because that bramble is juglone tolerant. That's not a bad thing. Bramble is a big component of a deer's diet. But when you look back in here, the bigger thing is that we're getting sunlight in here, and we need sunlight to create regeneration, which grows food. But this spot, we can point out some highly beneficial food sources in here that are often overlooked. Bramble is going to be one of those. The blackberries, black caps, so on and so forth. What's really unique about the bramble is during the summer months, it produces the leafy kind of herbaceous type of food sources, which is really high in protein for deer during the growing season. The leaf on a blackberry plant is right around 30% crude protein, which parallels what you get off of a soybean plant during the summertime. That's only one component of it. As the summer progresses, those berries produced on those brambles as well are a soft mass that deer will take advantage of at the same time. So they'll eat the berries, they'll eat the leaves, and then in the winter time, they'll come back through and they'll actually eat the stem itself. Whatever fresh growth from the last year was produced is the highest palatability. They're going to consume that as well as part of that kind of woody browse, but it's more in the bramble category. The other thing here to point out is on the herbaceous growth. So we want a lot of forbs, a lot of flowering forbs on a property, and legumes. The legumes are going to be higher in protein typically, but the forbs are also very high in protein and very high in mineral content. And this particular plant here is often looked at as a problem. I've got a dog here that's got a little beard like myself, and he loves to get this tangled up in his beard. This is beggar's lice. Beggar's lice at this stage has these really sticky seeds on it, right? It's a unique advantage as far as seed dispersal goes. Any animal walks through here, they collect the seeds, they later lose those seeds, spread these plants around the landscape. So it's kind of a nuisance in that sense. But during its vegetative state, while it's growing throughout the summer months, this plant is very, very high in proteins and nutrients for deer. So if you see this on your property, avoid it so you don't have to pick these off your clothes, but ultimately embrace it because it's very, very good deer food. And then the other thing too is these seeds, as much of a nuisance as they are bird food. So if you have ground nesting birds, if you're trying to get quail, grouse, even songbirds on your property, this is what they're feeding on during the wintertime. So it's part of that whole system and that whole cycle. And again, having diverse species from plants to animals on your property makes your deer hunting better, makes your deer healthier in general. So a lot of good food, a lot of potential food to pop up in here. We just got to look at what it takes to manage this so that these problem species like the buckthorn, there's some honeysuckle in here, there's some prickly ash, which isn't technically invasive, but it will start to take over areas with the absence of any form of disturbance. So we just want to look at how we manage these areas moving forward to make sure we're promoting the most abundance and the most diversity as a whole. So here we have another form of browse. This is going to be woody browse in general. So there's many forms of woody browse. There's stump regeneration or coppice regeneration that comes back after a tree is cut off. There's fresh seedling growth, and then there's root regeneration. So right here, this is regeneration from a poplar tree. Somewhere around here, there's probably one that got cut down not that long ago. So that's regenerating. Over here, there's some stump regen, where trees were cut off this edge. But this is another highly preferred food source for deer. And if you look at a graph of when deer seek out this type of food source, it is the most consistent food source in their diet throughout the entire year. But it really peaks and shines this time of year in the winter when there's not a lot of other available food for those deer. But so far what we're seeing on this property is a pretty good amount of hardwood regeneration post some of the logging that was done. And then the last type of browse that kind of fits into that same category is going to be the woody browse that comes from shrubs. So looking around up here, I see some elderberry shrubs, and before we saw some different viburnums, some nannyberry. So we have many different types of woody browse available on this property, which is great. It adds to that diversity element of the food availability, which means we're holding deer a lot more consistently. We're out here on the 18-acre agricultural ground on this property, i.e. the less than 20% of a deer's diet, the cultivated food sources. But what I want to emphasize there is we can utilize these cultivated food sources with more control to move deer or pull deer into more accessible, more huntable locations. On top of that, these act as an anchor because they can be more consistent as a food source. They can anchor deer and hold them on the property a lot longer throughout the year. So it is important. They are a very important component of a habitat management plan. But when we're out here looking at this particular blank slate, we have a lot of options, but I wanted to highlight the benefits of this specific situation. You can kind of see behind me that you can't see real well behind me because the topography slowly rolls over. And what that means is when a deer pops out of the woods on that side, they can't see all the way across the field to that side. Or when they pop out on that far end, they can't see all the way to the upper end. In fact, the access on the upper end of this property underneath those high lines, you cannot see from this location. Why is that awesome? Because you can get in and out of this hunting location without bumping those deer. Like I said, it's a blank slate. Based on your financial situation, the equipment that you choose to use, that's going to dictate what type of plot, what size of plot, and potentially the location of the plot based on those parameters. But right now, just looking at it for what it is, like I said, it's a blank slate. There's a lot of room to put food plots in here. There's a lot of room to restructure this open field if you want to convert it back to more native habitat with native warm season grasses or prairie plantings or what have you. A lot of potential in a location like this. When it comes to actually placing the food plot, we'll look at a map and decide how you want to structure the rest of the field, and then design that to pull deer through using cover to isolate our access and our exit strategy, as well as keep those deer safe so they move a lot more during daylight hours. So now we're on the north side of the property, on the north side of the field up there. But what I want to talk about here is sanctum, or sanctuary, which really comes from seclusion. There's a nice little flat spot in here, a little bench. It's not the bottom of the valley, which is ideal, but it's not the top either. It's that upper layer of the cake again. So if you look around behind me, you've got good cover with the topography back here, and then it rolls up and there's quite a bit of tops down from trees that blew down or logging and stuff like that. So there's good structural components there. With better management, there'd be a lot more vegetative cover and a lot more food. But this area in particular offers everything to deer to create seclusion. There's a nice little quiet pocket. It's far away from the road. It's far away from your access point. It's far away from the neighboring properties and their farms and all the commotion and whatnot. So this is a spot on a property that's going to consistently hold bucks, especially when the pressure increases later into the season, when those deer have been getting bumped around and bumped off of other properties and cover starts to kind of fall when the leaves come off the trees. This is one of those spots where a mature buck is going to spend a lot of time, and you can tell that that's the case because there's lots of rubs and stuff in this location. So a really, really cool location to create seclusion for mature bucks. So we're down here kind of at the head of this draw. There's big drainage here. The ravine comes down over there. A couple of ravines kind of converge over here, and they meet right behind me and flow down around the corner into that bigger valley. But what's interesting about a spot like this, the water flows down through here, and in the evenings and throughout most of the night when that cold air is sinking, it's going to flow down here similar to that water. So this creates kind of a thermal hub. There's some beds right here. Another really secluded location on this property. There's a lot of topographical fluctuation here. You got kind of a mound. This finger comes out here, that drops down. Then there's a hill that goes up all the way up to the field. This is a spot that a mature buck loves to bed in. They really love to bed out on those points around the edges of the ridges where they can see and have good visibility. And this sets up kind of the same way. If they park in here like this, they can look out across this. A lot of good easy escape routes, but a big thing here is they can smell everything that's happening in this bowl all the way around them. And there's a lot of good cover. On top of that, there's pretty good browse in here. There's some invasives that don't have a lot of food value, but we've got a lot of regeneration off of some of these hardwood species. There's some pretty good native shrubs in here, some pretty good bramble. A little bit of management, get a little bit of sunlight in here, the right form of disturbance, we can increase the amount of herbaceous growth in here as well. So this spot has a lot of potential to hold deer. It's already holding deer. I'm sure at the peak of the season, when the pressure is at its highest, this is a spot where mature bucks are spending a lot of time. Okay, let's talk about this for a second. Not this, but this right here. Try not to breathe this in because this is the spore or sporadic stage of this particular mushroom. When we talk about food sources for deer, another very commonly overlooked food source that makes up a pretty high percentage of a deer's diet, specifically during the fall and early winter months, is fungus. Mushrooms, the fruiting body of mycelium or fungus, such as puffball mushrooms like this. Again, this one's over mature in that sporadic stage, all the spores drifting out of here. But when this is smaller and growing, this is a preferred food source for deer. Puffballs, many other types of fungus or mushrooms, lichen and mosses, all fall into this category that we often overlook, but they are essential food sources for deer. As far as management goes, we just want to make sure we have a lot of good woody debris in the woods. A good, healthy forest ecosystem is going to have about a 30 or 40% component of dead or decaying biomass. And the mushrooms or fungus are deconstructors of that biomass. So you think about all the minerals that are pulled up from the ground through the root systems of these trees. When those trees die, the mushrooms deconstruct all those minerals, and they're a super mineral dense, high energy food source for those deer in the fall. So it's good to see these puffball mushrooms out here. Again, there's a lot of other species of mushrooms that deer consume, and that is one component of a deer's diet that we want to encourage in a healthy forest ecosystem. It makes those deer healthier, holds the deer a lot longer. When we assess bedding cover, we want to make sure, wherever possible, that we have diversity in that bedding cover, not just with the wind direction for those bucks to bed under, but also under different climatic conditions. So this location here I wanted to highlight because this is a pretty good cold weather thermal bedding location. A lot of people think that a solid stand of pine trees is a good thermal bedding location or thermal bedding cover, which it really isn't, because you don't get enough sunlight in there. And that's why this location is so good. It's south-facing aspect. The hill itself is blocking the cold north winds. We also have a stand of red pines back here. Obviously, all of the needles are way up high, so they're not really doing a lot to block much as far as like the wind at a deer's level. But the combination of the high density planting with those red pines and how the topography rolls right here, that blocks a lot of the wind. And then the south-facing aspect, we get a lot of sun in here. So from a deer's perspective, or how deer survive the winter, they go into the fall, they bulk up, right? The sugary, soft mass food on the landscape, the berries, the apples, stuff like that, the acorns are higher in fat. Those are the foods that pack on the body fat. And throughout the winter, they survive on high protein food sources like woody browse, and then they just lay around and they soak up the sun. So this spot is a perfect example. If I'm a deer, I can sit here, it's nice and sunny and warm, but the wind, that cold wind coming from the north, is completely blocked out of this location. So this is a really good thermal bedding location. We've already highlighted a handful of these on the property, but it's really good to see that. And typically, if we're going to design a property, we want to have a balance of good cold weather and good hot weather thermal bedding locations. The other component of this bedding location is the overhead canopy of these oaks. Specifically, we've got some red oaks and some white oaks in here, and you can kind of see the deer are still digging around. The red oaks, those acorns will sit on the ground, and those deer are going to dig those up throughout the entire winter time. The white oaks, they generally eat those as soon as they hit the ground. But when you have a nice bedding area like this, again, sheltered and secluded from human pressure and other pressures like predators and whatnot, and then also from the wind soaking up the sun, now you're adding a valuable food source in here with that hard mass. We can make it better by increasing the amount of woody browse and vegetation in the surrounding area, but this bedding area offers deer a lot of benefits in the wintertime.
All right, so we're back at the office. We just got off the property. Thomas was able to, looks like he walked about every square foot of the property. Before we get into this, make sure you go check out Thomas on social media. Go to the untamedambition.com if you want to hire him as a consultant. I would say the best consultant in Southwest Wisconsin. Are you covering more than just Southwest Wisconsin?
Yeah, I cover a pretty broad range, but most of my business, I try to focus most in the Driftless region.
Yeah, you do just like a more in-depth offer than anything I've ever seen. So what's your first initial gut reaction to this property?
As a whole, this property is amazing. The amount of surface area created by the fluctuations in topography beds a lot of deer. All of these blue waypoints on here were observed bedding locations, and not just like it would be a nice spot for deer to bed, but it had everything a deer needed to bed, and there was a bed there. You know, we walked this, I think we talked about it, last snow we had was a week or so ago. So all of that sign was within the last week, and you can tell, you know, what's melted, what's pawed up and whatnot. Most of those beds are from the last 24 to 36 hours. So you can see how many blue dots there are on there. We talked earlier about the diversity of bedding locations and what they offer on different wind directions, different climatic conditions. There's a lot of good bedding on here for hot days, for cold days, for west winds, for east winds, all of the things. So first impression, a lot of space for deer, a lot of places to hide deer, and that will lend to a higher carrying capacity on the property. So we can hold a lot of deer, but not just a lot of deer, there's a lot of potential for bucks on this property because there's a lot of layers of cover. So those does generally want to bed closer to the food sources. The bucks like to bed a little bit further away, or more so just in isolation from the food sources and where the does are bedding. And you get a lot of that in here. I often talk about this analogy of a multi-layered cake. There's a lot of that stacking up in here. If this food area is the base layer of that cake, the next layer of the cake separated by a layer of cover, that's the icing between those layers. That next layer of cake is this upper edge around the field and all the way out as that hill kind of rolls off. And there's a lot of beds around in there. And that's where we're finding those groups of multiple beds, most likely doe family groups. Then you get up to that next layer of the cake out towards the edge of the ridge line here, out on these fingers. And there were some really cool changes in topography. But out on those fingers, that next layer in there, a little bit deeper, that's where those bucks are bedded. So some of these are marked actual buck bedding locations. It doesn't mean a buck won't bed in any of these locations, but those specific locations that we found, single bed, top layer of the cake, lots of rubs in there, a lot of sign showing that bucks are there. This area down here was one really, really cool area that there's almost a little saddle here. This finger comes out and there's almost a little saddle. In this point right here, we found a rub that's bigger than my thigh and just torn up. In a bed
It's
right
like a
there.
rock shelf there.
It starts to get rocky as it goes down, but it's still a good location because the deer can still get out of there. So it's not so steep or cliffed out where they get pinned in. But the other unique thing about that specific location is from that location, you could see the truck. And that's, those mature bucks, certain levels of pressure will push them off a property, but if they can observe the pressure and monitor it, they feel safe. So a guy could easily park right here, get up in here to hunt in the morning. That buck's not going to be there. He's not going to care about that truck or that activity down there because he can monitor it and get away. At the same time, there's a lot of space in here to hold those deer. So that was just one example of a really cool bedding area. All along this ridgeline here, all along this ridgeline here, you get down on this bottom, there's this feature here where these two ravines meet. There's kind of a point that comes out in there. And again, it's like, goes out, there's a bench, drops down, there's another bench, drops down, there's another bench. Every one of those layers had beds on it and it's holding deer. Beyond just the bedding and the cover element of this property, which it has a ton of, the food value on this property and the food value potential is really, really high. So there's a lot of good browse. When we break down the different food groups for deer, browse is the foundation of their food, of their nutrition. In this situation, there was a lot of good woody browse. This area here was logged a little bit heavier, and then there was kind of some selective cuts throughout. But right in here, a lot of good bramble and a lot of good browse, hardwood regeneration. There was a lot of good native shrubs throughout down these lower areas. There is, I don't want to say a high component, but a relative component of invasive brush on the property that would need to be managed so that it doesn't completely take over. We want to encourage the native diversity, but it's not worse than any other property that I've seen. So that's just part of the equation with the long-term management game. But overall, food source-wise, a lot of potential for browse. What I would like to see on a property like this would be more herbaceous browse, more flowering forbs and whatnot, which depending on the long-term goals of the future buyer, we could easily incorporate pollinator plantings up in this field and basically a CRP planting where we can get the government to pay for these types of pollinator plantings or flowering forbs. I call them native food plots because that's what they are. That's going to be the bulk of a deer's diet throughout most of the year. And the beauty of that, and this kind of rough design I threw in here, is it creates conditioning where it's pulling those deer up to that field all the time for that food source. And then as the value of that food source starts to decline in the fall, the attractiveness of your food plots up in that same location increases. So it keeps those deer conditioned to stay in the area. But as far as the woody browse component goes, which is really the anchor on a property, there's a lot of that. There's also, on that same note, there's a lot of timber value in here still to be harvested. Most of the big walnuts were removed. There's a lot of walnuts in there that are going to be ready for timber harvest in probably 10, maybe 15-ish years. But there are a lot of big oaks that could still be harvested. Now, I'm not saying that to give you the idea to go out and log them all, but there is some logging that needs to be done to get more sunlight in there to get better regeneration. So the previous landowner, the current landowner, did a really good job of not over harvesting. So whoever buys this is going to have a lot of flexibility with how they want to shape the habitat in here and still keep a lot of really high quality mass producing trees with those oaks. And there's good diversity with the oaks. We had a lot of white oaks, a lot of bur oaks, and a lot of red oaks in there. So that's really good. And that's, a large portion of a deer's diet as well. So when we talk about woody browse, we talked about herbaceous browse, hard mass, soft mass. There's random apple trees throughout the whole property. Those are nice sweet treats for deer. Ultimately, by design, I'd like to see more soft mass in the food plot areas because those are super attractive during a relatively narrow window of time, which happens to fall right during the hunting season. So I kind of map some of that out from a creative perspective. So you see these lines on here, these pink lines. I refer to those as orchard edges. And we actually follow a lot of like the shepherd principles with that. So what I would do with a system like this is I actually would cut in a slope cut terrace to slow the water down and plant trees along that line. What that's going to do is it's going to break up this larger open field. And you're basically going to have food plots that are paralleled by diverse food species, soft mass, hard mass. You can mix in the chestnuts along with some more oaks, and then some mass producing shrubs along with browsy shrubs. So you create kind of these brushy hedgerows along there that break up your food plot and create even more food abundance in those feeding locations. And that just adds to the diversity of the whole system. So that's a big thing. A lot of food potential. Like I said, that all comes with ongoing management. Beyond that, the weak points of a property like this are the access, but the access actually is not that bad on this property. So we have this parking spot down here, a really good spot for someone to either put in a tent or a camper or a small cabin. At the same time, right next to the campground. So a guy could stay at the campground and hunt this too, for the in the short term,
electricity, right? Water, bathroom, showers.
Yeah, everything that you need
campground
to be mostly scent free, right? So that's a big advantage. We talked about morning access. There is an old road in here that could be cleaned up. This stand location here that I marked, these white spots are suggested stand locations, and there could definitely be more. We just have to sit down with the buyer and figure out their level of ambition and creativity to get into some of these other spots. But ultimately, I think a guy can come up in here for sure, access from the bottom up for a morning stand to catch deer cruising off of the food sources between bedding areas. And then at the same time, this road goes around. There's an old box blind down in here, a logging road that comes down. There's a concept that I refer to as through access. If we get a little bit creative on top here, this power line right away right here is really good access to get you on top of this field. Yes, it needs a culvert. That's not that big of a deal to get good access to get up in there. Once we get up on top, this red strip in the middle would be like a tall grass, switchgrassy type blend for screening. And there's enough topography on this field that you cannot see this corner from anywhere on the field. You have to be on top of the hill here to see this. So you can get all the way up on top of here and dink around up here, and deer all the way out here cannot see you. So that's a huge advantage. But if we put a 30-foot wide strip of screening grass down the middle of this, and it might not be exactly like that, but something like that, that allows us to get better access in and better exit out of this field location so we're not bumping deer. With that mentality or with that strategy, I think we can come up in here in the evening, hunt this back corner, and if you have an e-bike you can definitely do it on foot. E-bike's just a little bit faster. This is where you can employ that concept of through access, where you enter this way, but then you go out this way. At the same time, you could probably go out this way too once that screening is well established. But we want to create a lot of attraction in those evening hours, get those deer to flow up here, and then you can see all these edges. All these lines are edges. There's this concept I preach all the time, edge and flow. Deer are edge species. They flow along these edges, they bed along edges, they feed along edges. So we create a lot of edge structure and get those edges to flow in the direction we want to move deer. And topography creates an edge too, so we kind of want to use that topography so we keep that movement flowing in a consistent fashion. We can pull deer up out of all these bedding areas, and they're already going to want to move out towards those bigger destination fields in the evening, so we choke them down into these more huntable locations and get them so they're slowed down and they don't exit the property until well after dark. That's how we hold deer. That's how you have more control over your herd structure, your age structure, where you have the decision, or you get to make the decision on which deer to harvest and whatnot. So overall, I think there's some obstacles, but they're not that challenging in a scenario like this. Access is very, very doable. And this area up here is a lot more secluded. Again, I think you could get in there. There's an old stand up there. Obviously for the neighbors, it's not as deep, but it's still hard for them to get over to here to disturb this. And the other really cool thing about this property that I observed is this ravine, or this drainage in general, is pretty gradual. It doesn't just go straight down to a deep ravine. It drops down halfway down the hill. There's a little bit of a bench, drops down again, and at the bottom it flattens out where there's a bench, and then it drops into that ravine. So there's all this surface area in there for deer to spend time. Another really cool feature of this property, which I think you hit on right when we started talking earlier, is how this whole ridge is kind of pointed north-south for the most part, or this valley is mostly north-south. What does that mean? That means that basically any way you cut timber in here, you're getting maximum amount of sunlight to the forest floor. So that means maximum regeneration, more food, more cover. So you can look at this and, if it's a north-facing slope and it's super steep, sometimes you're limited by what you can improve there because it just doesn't get the sunlight. But this north-facing side is really gradual. And actually there's not a lot of high-quality tree species in there. It's a lot of box elder and elm and stuff like that. So that would be a good spot to thin out to begin with. But overall, all of this gets a lot of really good sun, and almost all of this side here, is loaded with big oak trees. So a guy could come in here, take out probably 50% of those oaks, no problem, just to release the really high quality mass producing trees. You're gonna get a nice chunk of change. You're gonna get your roads paid for sure. All of those things are highly beneficial from a management perspective, and this property has all of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not far away from being an absolute slam dunk. But for someone comes in here next year, none of these improvements are made yet. I mean, it's still set up well for success.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The biggest thing with the improvements in the design side of things is to create more consistent and predictable movement. Yeah. Right now, as it stands, someone could show up here, do absolutely nothing, and probably have fantastic hunting. It's just going to take a little bit more paying attention, doing your homework, trying to really figure out where these deer are moving and when, which is part of the fun, right? So you absolutely don't have to put a ton of work into a property like this to make it good for hunting, but adding that in there over time will make it that much better. And again, create more consistent, predictable movement that's going to increase your chances of success.
And it's key, like we know we have a lot of deer in this area. There are big deer in this area. There's been big deer harvested on this. So like that's kind of one of those ghost issues that you don't really know about. We do know that there's been really good deer harvested. You saw a sign with obvious big shooter type bucks.
This property has everything it needs to grow and hold Boone and Crockett deer. No problem at all. I mean, this area is known for 200 plus inch deer. So that's not a problem. The other thing, this is a 112 acre property, but with all the fluctuation in topography and how there's all these protected little nooks and crannies, and the fact that you can't access the whole thing super easily is advantageous. This property is going to hunt closer to like a 200, 250 acre property because of how the topography lays out.
I mean, like you cut this, there's houses up past here, but they're a long ways away from this. Like this field alone is super secluded.
Correct.
This section of woods might not have seen a person in years. Not sure how they were hunting it, but
yeah. I mean, it's hard to get in some of those spots, but that's a good thing. Yeah. Those deer know that. There's a concept in ecology that we talk about that's called landscape of fear, and that's where prey animals over time learn where the threats are on the landscape. So a property that has had a lot of abuse and a lot of pressure, it can take sometimes 5 to 10 years for those deer to bounce back and start to frequent areas that were previously pressured. So when you have a property that has bad access, or quote unquote bad access in certain areas, that can be very advantageous because this could very well be a spot. I mean, based on the sign, there's been big deer there recently, right? But this could be a spot that a big mature buck has been calling home for the last few years, and that's passed on generationally where these deer find these low pressure areas and sink into them. And this spot has everything for that.
And this is a low pressure hunting property. I'm not sure. I don't think anyone was hunting it with a bow. They certainly were not hunting it seriously. The owner, they weren't spending a lot of time back here. It just, there's probably been big bucks hiding back in there for years. And I look at this as like, I would just like cut this off and just not even step foot.
Yeah, stay out of that back corner.
Until you go in and do timber stand management stuff. But yeah, you look at it like you can definitely go blast in some roads and it'll make it easier to get around. But yeah, walking in there, it's almost like you don't really want to. You don't want to ruin what's already in there. But and there is decent road systems up through.
Yeah, they're not all mapped out, but there are logging roads that just need to be kind of polished up. There's a few that kind of cut in. And the big thing with the road system on a property like this, from my perspective, is going to be the management efficiency, right? Yeah. So when it ultimately comes down to a management plan for a property like this, what we would do is we would break it up into different habitat units. We would define each area on the property based on the vegetative makeup, what it currently is and or what we want it to be, and then we manage each unit individually at staggering intervals so we create better edge effect, right? If two parallel units are both oak stands, but we cut one and then we cut the other one 15 years later, we have a staggered rate of succession there, which creates really good edge structure, creates more of that flow around those edges. So if we do that and we utilize the road system to create burn breaks for our management, it just simplifies things across the board. So that's kind of a couple more steps down the road in the process based on the next buyer's long-term goals for the property. But the current road system in there gives you really good access. There is a road that runs, we have to clean it up to connect to it, but there is a road that runs along the entire bottom of this. And actually, I think it comes out by this high line here. So why do I say that? Because if you harvest a deer, most likely it's going to run downhill, and being able to get a UTV or an ATV or a machine of some sort in there to get that deer out would be a lot easier.
Yeah, if you put a kill shot on an animal on this property, it should not get off your property.
No, definitely not. It's going down into one of these thick pockets, and there's a lot of really good secure bedding cover on this property.
Yeah. Well, you already have a big head start on the planning of this property with having Thomas come out here and do this prior, but whoever buys this will be in a really good position to bring you in and take you, let you take them the rest of the distance to, I mean, the second I saw this, started studying this property, I'm like, yeah, Thomas needs to come down here and take a look at it, because just from my not that well trained eye, it was.
Yeah, it's all the potential in the world.
And there's a couple little things that a hunter that wants to put a little, I mean, there's not even that much work that needs to go into, but there's little things, like if you want to, drive a UTV right up to a stand, like there's things that you have to do to it, but man, it's unique to find a property with like that much good timber, a decent food source that's hidden, it's not exposed, at that acreage in this area. It's a pretty unique property.
When it comes to food sources, food plots, or any food source that I've been speaking of, location is the most critical factor, right? A low quality, nutritionally wise food source in a secure location will be utilized a lot more frequently than a super high quality food source in an area that gets a lot of pressure. But that, like I was saying, this whole field is completely secluded. You cannot see past this ridge line right here from anywhere on this field unless you're standing up there. So, from a deer's perspective, they pop out along one of these edges. They can't see across the field. Why is that important? It creates that sense of security. It also provokes curiosity with those deer, so they don't stand in one spot and just look down the field road or the field edge. They come out and they start moving right away, and that's what you want. You want deer moving, movable deer or moving deer or huntable deer. So
I can't imagine. I mean, daylight hours, big bucks have taken this route multiple times.
Yeah, they've cut that right there is kind of a little saddle. Yep.
Yeah. And they probably do it. They do it on this saddle too. Like, it'd be interesting. It'd be really interesting to hunt it, just to see, because you know, like sometimes you think like, oh, a big buck's not gonna walk out into this wide open field, but it's such a secluded field. It hasn't been pressured. Yeah.
Well, and that's exactly it. It doesn't feel as wide open, right? When you get
Yeah.
down at a deer's level and you look, you can only see 75 yards.
Well, and I didn't even mind, like, we came in this, and I was surprised by, like, you have your little shelf in the woods starting here, but then it drops off right away. Like, you're not busting everything out of a bed, even if you don't have that screening.
In this area,
But if you put a screen in there, you're getting in and out without.
no problem at all. Yeah, in this area here where it was logged, there's a really good brushy edge there, a lot of brambles in there, so that's creating a good soft edge there where deer can't see very well. This side, the hill starts to drop off a little bit more, where once you get down on this lower shelf here, you cannot see the top. You can't see the field because it goes and it breaks and it goes and it breaks. So, you know, there's a lot of easy improvements that can be done on a property like this, but at the same time, it doesn't require any work to be functional. And that's the beauty of a system or a property like this, is we could put together a really good plan based on your budget, based on your timeline, and go, okay, how much time and money do you want to invest to make it better year in and year out? Let's start with the low-hanging fruit. We've got a good baseline to start with, but let's start moving deer where we want to move deer. You know, real simple things, creating better pinch points in certain areas, but there's a lot of pinches already created by the topography. There's a lot of travel corridors created by the topography that it's just going to take a little bit of time for someone to get in there, drop some cameras in there, and figure out where that mature buck is spending his time on any given day, which I can tell you right now, again, westerly wind direction, those deer are spending the bulk of their time around this edge right here, where that west wind's coming off the field. And that's why strategically I like having food on that east side of the hill, because the deer want to spend their time on that leeward side of the hill where the wind's coming over the hill. That allows them to approach a food source with the wind in their face. These pink solid lines, a strategy that I utilize when we plant these orchard edges. Sometimes they're super high density plantings, sometimes they're just, you know, a tree every 25 feet. But generally we put in a lot of trees and shrubs, and it's a lot easier to fence them all in one block. So strategically what we'll do is we'll fence a solid block off and create a hard edge, and that forces deer to move in around the outside. So we basically create another pinch point here where deer that want to enter the system have to come in from the ends, and then they kind of flow through it. At the same time, the other advantage to that is in an area like this where there are high deer numbers, when we already have these fenced off, all we have to do is put a fence across either end, and we can keep that food plot protected so that we ensure that we have high quality food during the hunting season. And then we just drop the fences on the end and the deer start flowing through there again. So again, there's a lot more that we can fine tune with a design like that based on the new owner's goals, what their budget is, how much time they want to put in the property, and what they see for their vision. But right here, this is just kind of a quick and dirty, like this is a possibility, something we can add to it. And, you know, and again, depending on the financial situation or what your long-term goals are, this property qualifies for a lot of government aid type programs. You know, all the invasives that are on there would fall under an EQIP contract where they would pay you to get rid of those invasives on a per acre basis. The beauty of that is it's not a long-term contract. You get approved, you do the work, they pay you for it. There's some timber stand improvement that would fall underneath that as far as reducing the amount of the non-timber species in there. And then again, this whole field here could be a field conversion that is separate CRP contracts outside of the food plot, where you would basically get paid to put in native grass cover for those deer, native perennial food plots for those deer. And it also obviously benefits your ground nesting birds. And if you're a turkey hunter, this property is an amazing turkey property for sure. A little bit of management.
Big oaks, they got some good roosting trees.
Lots of roosting trees, lots of acorns. I mean, this property, it really has it all. And it's just an absolutely gorgeous area.
Yeah. And it's good to know that there's good timber in there, because I think, you know, like if I'm buying this, the first thing I'm doing is I want to get that road in and then clean up some of these roads. And you should be able to cover that with your timbers.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I would say don't hold me to it.
Yeah, we can't guarantee what you get.
Yeah, there's a good chunk of change in there. You know, and again, I generally take a very conservative approach to cutting oaks specifically. And now, if there was a lot of big walnuts in there, walnuts are great from a monetary standpoint. From a wildlife standpoint, they're not as beneficial, obviously, as oaks. But with the amount of oaks in there, and big oaks too, big, straight oaks, there's a lot of them in there that could come out and it would be beneficial not just financially, but it would let the other trees grow, release a little bit more, get more light to the ground. So there's a lot of logging that needs to happen in here, but again, it doesn't have to happen in the immediate future, and it can still happen, and the property can still be really good if you have a good logging plan and leave the right trees in the right locations.
Yeah, it's a slam dunk. I hope, you know, if you're a hunter and you're able to swing it, let's take a look at it. And I don't think it's going to last that long.